What's going on, everybody? Welcome into the Fantasy Football Last Call. I'm your host, Dylan Clemons, here with me, as always, my co-host, Mike Laplant. What's up, friend?
Oh, just enjoying this fine Monday. Ready to recap some football with you quickly. So let's jump into it.
Recapping Fantasy Football Playoffs Week 1. But before we get started, please smash the like button. Please subscribe to the Fantasy Six Pack YouTube channel. We appreciate it. And head on over to fantasysixpack.net/plans and check out our membership as we get closer to your fantasy championships. But without further ado, let's jump right into it, Mike. We got a lot of games to talk about. Our first one on Saturday that ended up being a thriller was the Minnesota Vikings beating the Indianapolis Colts 39-36 after being down 30-0 at halftime. 30 or 33-0.
33.
33-0 at halftime, and they come away victorious in this one. Yeah, Kirk Cousins with 32 fantasy points. Big day for him. Dalvin Cook also has a good day. Doesn't find the end zone. Yes, he does. I'm sorry. Finds the end zone through the air. 27 fantasy points. With that being down the whole game, man, it was volume galore for KJ Osborne and Justin Jefferson, both getting 16 targets and both putting up over 30 fantasy points. Thielen caught a touchdown late to salvage his day, and Hockenson was the lone disappointment in this offense. Just a huge day for that offense, man, because they were trailing the entire game until the very end. Jumping over the Colts side of things, Matt Ryan, tough day at the office, just 11 fantasy points. JT, Jonathan Taylor, goes down to what is now diagnosed with a high ankle sprain, and it's announced that he is going to be out. Sounds like he's going to be out for the rest of the season. So it's going to be a combination of Zach Moss and Deion Jackson in the backfield. It was Zach Moss who saw 24 attempts in this one for 81 yards. Michael Pittman, 14 targets. And then Deion Jackson caught the touchdown through the air. Nothing other to talk about from this offense other than the JT injury, and it's going to be a combination of Zach Moss and Deion Jackson. And Jackson's probably the PPR guy, and Zach Moss is going to be the red zone guy, I would assume. Mike, do you agree?
Yeah, for the most part, Deion Jackson, we know that has had that role before Zach Moss came into town, so I'd roll with Jackson rolling forward. But we'll move on to our next game here, and we can really go through this very quickly. Divisional battle, Cleveland Browns versus Baltimore Ravens. Cleveland ended up coming out on top 13-3. And really, there's not much to talk here, about anything. Deshaun Watson had 12.6 fantasy points. Whoop-de-doo. Nick Chubb disappointed with 9.9 fantasy points. I guess if you were bold enough to start Donovan Peoples-Jones this week, he paid off getting the touchdown. Getting you 13.1 fantasy points. Amari Cooper only had 9.8. So really, not much to talk about from this offense other than Peoples-Jones got the touchdown for you. Hopefully better days ahead for him. And Nick Chubb, 1 yard away from 100 yards. Otherwise, he did have an all right day. Moving on to the Ravens here. Really, this is even less to talk about. Tyler Huntley, just atrocious, 6 fantasy points. Really, the only one to talk about here. You could throw Mark Andrews in. He had 6.1 fantasy points. Whoop-de-doo. But J.K. Dobbins looking real good off the injury. Now this is second straight week with 100-plus yards. He had 125 yards rushing this week, finishing with 12.8 fantasy points. Kind of looks like they got their running back now. Now it's just, is it in time? Because they need Lamar back to be able to get back to full form. But other than that, biggest takeaway is just Dobbins coming on strong here at the end of the season. Same with Donovan Peoples-Jones.
Yep. And then our final game on Saturday night, he had the Buffalo Bills beating Miami Dolphins 32-29. Just that was an awesome game, guys. But it ended up being a snow globe game in the last 10 minutes of it. But Josh Allen, huge day, 33 fantasy points. But the running backs, decent days. James Cook, I'm blanking on his name, sorry. He catches a touchdown to save it for the running backs, and Singletary also had 10 PPR points. Then it was Dawson Knox catching a touchdown and leading it, 8 targets, catching 6 of them. Stephon Diggs, disappointed. Gabe Davis didn't have the ceiling game we thought he could, only 9 points. Just a huge day from Josh Allen. It's just kind of surprising that none of his weapons outside of Dawson Knox had big days alongside with him. That's weird. Jumping over the Dolphins side of things, Tua, solid day at the office, 18 fantasy points, but it was really a Raheem Mostert with Jeff Wilson out. He carved up this Buffalo run defense, 17 attempts for 136 for 16 PPR points, and then you had both receivers having good nights. 20 PPR points for Jaylen Waddle and 21 points for Tyreek Hill. Mike, my biggest takeaway here is it was good to see Tua be solid once again and be able to put together a solid week after a few clunkers back to back.
Yeah, especially since he was like historically bad last week. So for him to bounce back and put up a fight is definitely good. We'll move on to our first game of Sunday slates. It was the New Orleans Saints versus the Atlanta Falcons. First start for Desmond Ridder. All in all, had a rookie day. 7.7 fantasy points. Really, the story for the Falcons was how efficient Tyler Algier was on the ground. 139 yards, had a touchdown, finished with 19.6 fantasy points. Even Cordell Patterson had a touchdown, getting 11.2 fantasy points if you're bold enough to start him. But my biggest takeaway from the Falcons was Drake London. 11 targets, 7 for 70. He didn't get a touchdown, only 12 fantasy points, but the volume was there. We like seeing it. There's a lot more volume here to be had with Desmond Ridder as the quarterback moving forward. And it looks like even it's opening up lanes for Tyler Algier as well. Moving on to the Saints, we had this was just kind of a weird. If you look at the box score, guys, you're gonna have a weird time deciphering this one.
Taysom Hill,
Andy Dalton, 2 touchdowns through the air, 14 fantasy points. But Taysom Hill also had a touchdown through the air, 80 yards passing. No receiving. He had 30 yards rushing. All in all, he had a 10.2 fantasy points. And then Alvin Kamara finished with 10.4 fantasy points. Pretty mundane if you started him. But the biggest takeaways is Juwan Johnson catching 2 touchdowns here. Only getting 6 targets, but 22.7 fantasy points. And Rashid Shaheed, he was the one who caught the bomb from Taysom Hill for his touchdown, and that's where most of his points came from, 18.5. But really, the story was Juwan Johnson. It seems like with Andy Dalton in the lineup, he's a top 10 tight end, top 8 tight end, easily.
Yep, he sure is, man. But next game, we got the Pittsburgh Steelers taking care of business and beating Carolina 24-16. Mitch Trubisky, 14 fantasy points, whatever. Najee Harris, 24 attempts, 86 yards, 1 touchdown on the ground. Jaylen Warren also finds the end zone. No PPR work for Najee, though, but still finishes with 14.6 fantasy points. And then the guy in the passing game was Deontay Johnson this week, catching all 10 of his targets. Weird, man, considering they were coming from Mitch Trubisky. For 98 yards, doesn't find the end zone, but you'll take that. 10 for 98, that's 20 PPR points right there, pretty much. So you'll take that every day of the week.
Oh, yeah.
Jumping over to the Panthers side of things, guys, they got down in this game, so it's really hard for them to play at their strengths because, they just want to run the ball. The running backs did nothing. DJ Moore was the lone bright spot in this offense, catching the 1 touchdown for 18.3 PPR points. So if you had to start him in a pinch, you were good with that. But my biggest takeaway here, Mike, is if Carolina gets down in games, the running backs become irrelevant, unfortunately, because their offense isn't good.
And it looks like, I'm not going to say this consistently, but DJ Moore likes Sam Darnold a lot more.
Yeah, yes it is.
So we'll move on to what I thought was a pretty good game here. It was a thriller, came down to the end. Unfortunately, the Jets couldn't pull it off, even though they got in field goal range. The Lions ended up beating the Jets 20-17. All in all, not a very good day fantasy-wise. No ceilings were really met, but Amon-Ra St. Brown, 15.2 fantasy points. Khalif Raymond, 16.3 fantasy points. DeAndre Swift even got involved with 12.5 fantasy points. And then we had 1 reception for a Brock Wright, the tight end, getting him the touchdown to help give him the lead and finishing it with 12.1 fantasy. Yeah, 12.1 fantasy points. The only disappointment really in this offense was Jared Goff and Jamal Williams. But other than that, the offense pretty much shined, and we knew this. It's going to be one of the running backs here, or it's going to be the passing game that shines. Unfortunately, this team just can't have it all. Moving on to the Jets here. Zach Wilson got the start, had 2 touchdowns, 1 pick, finishing with 20.4 fantasy points, surprisingly. If you started him, congratulations. I don't know if anybody actually did, though. But again, nothing to be had on the ground. Zonovan Knight, 2.3 fantasy points. Michael Carter, 3.1. I mean, through the air, though, it's a little bit of a different story. Garrett Wilson got rolling late. He finished with 13.8 fantasy points, 98 yards overall on the day. And then some guy named Jeff Smith, 11.7 fantasy points. I mean, Elijah Moore got involved a little bit here, 9.4. But really, the guy hogging all the fantasy points here was CJ Azuma, catching both touchdowns from Zach Wilson, finishing with 18.1 fantasy points. With Zach Wilson as the starting quarterback, my biggest takeaway here is outside of Garrett Wilson, you can't trust really anybody. Maybe the running backs moving forward in better matchups, but the Lions was not the matchup for running backs.
I agree with you there, pal. Next game, we got Philadelphia Eagles taking care of business, beating the Chicago Bears in Chicago 25-20. Jalen Hurts, I watched this game in its entirety, and he didn't have a good NFL game, but he absolutely smashed for fantasy purposes, 34 fantasy points. It's Miles Sanders who killed your fantasy teams today, guys, getting 1.9 points. Just an awful day for him, which is weird. The Bears are awful at stopping the run. But A.J. Brown, big-time story once again, 9 for 181, 27 PPR points. And Devonta Smith was also solid, 5 for 126, 17 PPR points. Both of those pass catchers, you're starting them every week. Miles Sanders, we thought this was a smash matchup for him, but he just didn't hit, man. And, he was really scoring earlier this season because of touchdowns, and he really just hasn't been getting the touchdowns lately, so I feel like that's a little bit why he's struggling more, Mike. But jumping over to the Bears side of things, you have Justin Fields, another solid day for him, 14-21, 152 through the air, but he had 95 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns for 23 fantasy points. Montgomery, if you had to start him, you were happy with his 24-point output, getting a touchdown on the ground and through the air, but there's nothing really else to talk about. We thought maybe Cole Kmet would be fine. He wasn't, 4 for 25. But yeah, you're starting Justin Fields every week, guys. And then Montgomery, as long as the pass catcher's out, if he's getting PPR work, I know he only got 3, but caught one as well. You're starting him pretty much as your RB2 and you're feeling cool.
Yeah, as long as the PPR dictates it. Moving on to our next game, though, and it was an overtime game here. The Kansas City Chiefs beating Houston on a walk-off touchdown from Jerick McKinnon. He was the story of the day. Jerick McKinnon finishing with 32.2 PPR fantasy points, getting 2 touchdowns overall on the day. Just heavily involved here. Isaiah Pacheco fumbled early, so this great matchup for Pacheco just didn't pan out, and it worked more in McKinnon's favor. And realistically, he was the whole story on the Chiefs side. Kelsey had a good day, 20.5 fantasy points. Juju, 16.8. Marquez reached double digits with 11.6, but really it was McKinnon. Mahomes, good day, 30.7 fantasy points, but that's as expected. Moving on to the Texans, because if you couldn't figure it out, my biggest takeaway was Jerick McKinnon seems to be the guy moving forward if Pacheco can't be trusted. So we'll move on to the Texans here. This will be a quick one here because really only one that showed up here was Davis Mills. 18.9 fantasy points. He had 2 touchdowns through the air, 1 on the ground, which really, helped boost his day, but really nothing anywhere else. Quarantino, I don't know how to pronounce his name, to be honest with you, caught one of the touchdowns, and then Jordan Akins got the other touchdown and got 11.2 fantasy points. Biggest takeaway from this offense is you don't want to really start anybody.
Yep, agreed. The next game we got, which was a thriller, we had Jacksonville winning at home over Dallas, 40-34. We had started with the Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence, big day, 27 fantasy points. ETN bounces back nice, does fumble again. He does seem to have a little bit of a fumbling issue. 12 PPR points. It was the story here was Zay Jones catching 3 touchdowns for 109, 34 PPR points. Mike, good call on him this weekend. Christian Kirk also solid, catching 6 balls, 50 PPR points. And Evan Ingram catching 8 of his 10 targets. Evan Ingram you might just throw him in there with how well Trevor Lawrence is cooking right now, man. You feel pretty confident with their chemistry together. I'm cool starting Ingram every week. But Zay Jones, I was kind of ripping on him a little bit that he was a little inconsistent, but it's back-to-back weeks now where he's been really good. I just hope that floor stays high with him.
As long as Trevor Lawrence can zing it like he has been, man, because that's the key factor right there. Because he's on fire.
Yeah, he is cooking for sure. We got Dak Prescott at the Cowboys. Dak was okay, 22 fantasy points. Both running backs also solid. Zeke finds the end zone because that's what Zeke does, 15 fantasy points. Pollard with 14. Noah Brown actually with 22 PPR points. Probably weren't starting him anywhere. And then you got CeeDee Lamb with 19 PPR points. Biggest takeaway, the guys who we thought were going to hit, Mike hit. They just didn't get ceiling games, really. You know what I mean? CeeDee was able to do what he did. The running backs were fine, but tough matchup for them next week against Philadelphia. So,
yep. Well, we'll stay tuned. On to the next game here, and it was a battle of the backups. Brett Rippon for Denver taking on Colt McCoy for Arizona Cardinals, and Denver came out on top, 24-15. Really, I guess the biggest story here from this game was Latavius Murray for the Broncos, finishing with 21.2 fantasy points. He got the touchdown for him on the ground, had 130 yards on the ground as well. Did not see this coming. I mean, it was a good matchup, but this offense did not, warrant this good of a rushing game, in my opinion. Jerry Jeudy, 14.6 fantasy points, nothing too special. Tomlinson caught a touchdown, got 11.8. Marlon Mack also got a touchdown as well, got 16.3. Other than that, Brett Rippon, just 8.7. Moving on to the Cardinals here. DeAndre Hopkins led the team in receiving and had 13 fantasy points. Other than that, it was really just James Conner getting the touchdown here, finishing with 18.1 fantasy points as well. McSorley just did not get it done. He also got, McCoy also got hurt, and that's the reason why McSorley had to come in, and the offense even took a step further back. But really, the biggest takeaways here from is, everybody takes a step down in fantasy value, but I think Hopkins and Conner are still playable moving forward.
Agree. Next game, this one was a thriller too on another walk-off. The Vegas Raiders beat New England 30-24. Start with the Raiders. You got Derek Carr, 3 touchdowns, 20 fantasy points. He was solid. You have Josh Jacobs, another good day for him as well. 13 PPR points, decent day. Waller came back, caught a touchdown. Nice to see from him, Mike. Mac Hollins also catches a touchdown on 8 targets. But it was Devontae Adams who disappointed today, which the Patriots took out the Raiders' best weapon. Sometimes it happens. But nothing really to worry about there moving forward. Mac Hollins, we've seen him explode here and there, but you just can't rely on him consistently, especially in the fantasy playoffs. Mac Jones on the Patriots side of things was just atrocious today. 13-31. It was really just Ramondre Stevenson, Mike. 1 touchdown. He found the end zone once for 172. Also catching 2 passes for 24 PPR points. Really, he was legitimately the show for them. Jacoby Myers tries to lateral the ball back to Mac Jones in a tie game and throws it right to Chandler Jones, Mike, for the loss. That's just one of the most incredible things.
Worst ways to lose I think I've ever seen.
That's atrocious. But moving forward, Ramondre Stevenson's really the only guy who you need to start in this offense. Jacoby Myers is borderline.
Even off that injury, Ramondre was phenomenal. That's what surprised me. Moving on to the next game here, and it was another close one. Chargers pulling one out with a last-second kick, 17-14 against the Tennessee Titans. Chargers, really nobody flourished here. The highest scorer for their day was Keenan Allen, had 16.6 fantasy points. Then you had a tie between Mike Williams and Justin Herbert at 10.7. So really, not much to talk about here. Fantasy-wise, Austin Eckler got the touchdown, but only finished with, 13 fantasy points, or 15 fantasy points, my apologies. So ceiling not reached there. Biggest takeaway is this offense is working its way together better, NFL-wise, which seems to be affecting the fantasy portion of it, but hopefully things can come together because this was a great matchup for Herbert, and he really struggled. But moving on to the Giants, the Titans, here, Derrick Henry was the main star, finishing with 26.3 fantasy points, getting a touchdown on the ground, 104 yards on the ground as well. Also had 59 yards receiving. You like to see that. But other than that, it was Okonkwo who had 10 fantasy points. Tannehill got injured, left the game for a little bit. You had Malik Willis in there for a little bit, but then Tannehill came back, but nothing, special to write home about. Only 11.7 fantasy points. Biggest takeaway is the only one you can start consistently from this offense is Derrick Henry, and we knew this.
Yeah, it's playoff Derrick Henry, so he's going to keep on rolling for you. The next game we got Cincinnati Bengals beating Tampa Bay Buccaneers 34-23, just a tale of two halves here. In all honesty, the Bengals couldn't get anything going in the first half, but Burrow ends up throwing 4 touchdowns, 23 fantasy points. Great day for him. Mixon, he was the big disappointment in this offense. He still finished with 10 PPR points, getting 5 balls, but 11 for 21 on the ground. Then you got Jamar Chase, good 19 PPR points with a touchdown. Tyler Boyd catches a touchdown. Higgins catches a touchdown as well, so you're happy with all those guys jumping over to the Bucs side of things. This offense was good in the first half, and then it looked like the stinky offense that we've seen all season. Brady does throw 3 touchdowns, 1 in garbage time for 18 fantasy points to salvage his day. You have Leonard Fournette outscoring Rachaad White 11-5 in the backfield this week. Had about the split number of carries. Godwin catches a touchdown, 22 PPR points, 8 returns. And Mike Evans, 5 for 83. So he was decent today. And then it was Russell Gage. I'm not saying roster Russell Gage, but he catches the 2 touchdowns on 12 targets. But it was good to see Mike Evans get 10 targets and do stuff with them a little bit, Mike. You just wish he would have got in the end zone, but it's still a little bit of encouragement moving forward.
Yeah, volume upticked.
Yep. But yeah, guys, that wraps up the Fantasy Football Last Call. If you haven't already, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. We appreciate it. And head on over to fantasysixpack.net/plans. And just check out the content that we got flowing this week as we head into round 2 over at YouTube. We got the Fantasy Edge, we got the Fantasy Six-Pack Hour, and you got the Wolfpack Fantasy Football Podcast on Friday nights. But for Mike, I'm Dylan. We will talk to you guys next week.